Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. Happy Thursday to you all. We have another fantastic show predicated upon college football. And this time, it's going to be more player profiles. We have an interesting crop of 4 guys, and then our last segment will actually be a win prediction, again, much like yesterday. But before we get into any of that, before we get into all the exciting prospects all of these players bring, I do want to remind you yet again to please like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as a whole. It is greatly appreciated by all concerned, and if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. This will be subject to change once I become a live show, so make yourselves available to all the ways you can interact with the show as I am live. You can ask questions through Super Chat, Super Thanks, or Super Stickers. You can also leave tips and donations there, but as of right now, GSMC.cloud is the way to go for any tips and donations or questions, comments, or concerns about the show. Without further ado, let us jump right into today's show and today's players that I'm going to be examining. And the first player that I'm going to take a quick look at is a player who really hasn't fully realized his potential at a school where cranking out 5-star recruits was the norm in their former coach's era. I'm talking about Jimbo Fisher. I'm talking about Texas A&M. And this receiver was kind of the epitome of what could have been for Texas A&M. 5-star recruit, had all the potential in the world. Injuries maybe beset him. Maybe the whole cultural and social divide that was kind of felt between coach and school came into play here. But now he's starting a new chapter in his college football career at beautiful Oregon, where he will be part of a wide receiver room that looks like it could be the best in the country. And he will have a quarterback who has been one of the most dominant college football QBs of the entire decade, I do believe that myself. And without further ado, let's jump right into the college football player profile of Evan Stewart. Last year was a weird year for Evan Stewart, and so many years for him at Texas A&M were weird years. 18 games, in fact, for Texas A&M for a former 5-star recruit, 1,163 yards and 6 TDs, and that was all he had in his Texas A&M career. Last year, he only had 38 catches for 514 yards and 4 touchdowns. So majority of his production did come last year, but it was kind of rendered a moot point because Texas A&M were not competitive, and he really didn't get a chance to shine. His best game was 27.5 fantasy points in terms of fantasy against New Mexico, where he had 8 catches for 115 yards and 2 touchdowns. And his worst game was against Stanford. It was for a start, mind you, was actually against Alabama. 6.1 points, 3 catches, 46 yards, and 0 touchdowns. So the question concerning Evan Stewart was, well, why didn't he get his career going at Texas A&M? Why didn't he become what people thought he was going to be? Well, a lot of factors could have played in. Like I said, Jimbo Fisher may not have been the proper coach for him. He may have just been concerned about increasing the national profile of Texas A&M rather than seeing a result on the field. And perhaps that's what led to all these recruits coming in and not seeing their production immediately be a factor. But also, it could speak to perhaps the style of play that Texas A&M has. When I think about Texas A&M, I don't necessarily think about star receivers, even going all the way back to, say, the Johnny Manziel era. I think about receivers who just, in some way or another, fit the Texas A&M ethos. They're not necessarily true number one receivers who stand out, and they're not meant to be, because I feel like Texas A&M is more about gaining the most out of what your quarterback does in terms of distributing the wealth of the football. And I don't think that necessarily fit the profile of Evan Stewart. So why does he do this past offseason? He transfers to Oregon, where a lot of things could be in play for him. A lot of good scenarios and good outlooks could be in play for Evan Stewart this year. If we look at the Oregon wide receiver room, yes, there's already someone who is cemented as perhaps the true go-to number one receiver. And Tez Johnson had a fantastic season last year, even behind Troy Franklin, so you do expect him to get the lion's share of targets. You have Trayshawn Holden, another intriguing transfer out of Alabama, who also kind of wasn't necessarily viewed as someone who fit Alabama's ethos, where you definitely do think about star receivers in that Alabama scheme. And Trayshawn Holden, I guess, did not fit that profile, but I do like him from what I've seen of him. He's a savvy route runner, good hands, kind of nice after contact speed as well. So this is a very well-rounded wide receiver room. And where Evan Stewart fits into it could be what separates Oregon from the rest of the Big 12. Or the Big 10, sorry. The reason why Oregon is viewed as a Big 10 contender is because not anything to do with the recruiting, because they've done very well. It's because they already know their kind of MO. If you saw last year, Bo Nix, outstanding dual threat abilities, really was one of his better seasons in college football. We know all his trials and tribulations. And also Troy Franklin, really becoming a nice go-to wide receiver, but also having the supplementary pieces. This is a very well-rounded overall team last year. And Dan Lanning is trying to recreate that through the portal, and he did that to a T. By bringing in Dillon Gabriel, you bring in perhaps the best dual-threat QB of the past decade. He has some of the most passing yards, could become the ultimate passing yards leader in college football history this season. And when I think about him, I think about someone who just competes at such a high level and gets the most out of his receivers in turn. Because you think about Dillon Gabriel's career, he also was kind of in systems where the receivers were not the dominant forces we know them to be. At UCF, he certainly was the star. At Oklahoma, he certainly felt like he was the star. And now at Oregon, he's in a place where he definitely is going to profile as the big star of this offense. At the end of the day, he's the one with all the plaudits, all the accolades, and his name alone should excite a lot of Big Ten fans. But bringing in all these nice receivers, having Tez Johnson there, really makes a statement for Oregon. But here's where Evan Stewart is going to be the guy that can either sink the ship or keep it on course. When I think about wide receiver rooms and how wide receiver rooms are now viewed, especially in college football, as more and more teams dip into the transfer well, they're trying to find pieces that, while are semi-viewed as solid wide receiver twos, or maybe even wide receiver ones, like what Texas had to do, they're all concerned with filling out specific roles tailored to their teams. When I think about Oregon specifically, and I think about a guy like Tez Johnson, compared to Evan Stewart, who has had a very tumultuous career in college football where not a lot was steady. Maybe his whole mindset surrounding Texas A&M really took a toll on him, let's say. And he's just trying to get right. That could really impact his production, especially when Dillon Gabriel himself is new and he's looking for someone to kind of connect himself with the system by. And so, when I think about Evan Stewart, yes, he's a fantastic wide receiver with a lot of potential, as we've seen with the way people viewed him in recruiting. I don't necessarily think it will translate as much to what Oregon sees in wide receiver twos. And this may seem like I'm dissuading you from picking him, but it's just something to be wary of as he transitions from a team where he wasn't necessarily viewed as someone who had all this potential, and they must use it, to a team that really sees him as more of a supplementary part to a whole. If that makes any sense. If I were Dillon Gabriel, I would immediately target Tez Johnson. Because Tez Johnson, like I've said about so many different players in college football in the past, has cemented himself as someone who's experienced, and experience matters, like I often say. I'm not saying that Evan Stewart shouldn't be getting a number of targets. I do think that there's still value to him, but it's just in a different way than a player like Tez Johnson. Now, looking at Oregon's schedule, there are definitely places where you could really factor in Evan Stewart should you take him in fantasy college football. Because I think that the big games, a lot more will come down to individual quality. Say against Ohio State. That game will likely determine October 12th, a fantastic week in college football, if I do say so myself in terms of games. If right, it's a little bit push and pull kind of like a game. I feel like individual quality will separate that. So maybe shy away from picking Evan Stewart in that situation, because in terms of individual quality, while Dillon Gabriel can take over any college football game he's in, and Tez Johnson, as his receiver, could also play a big factor. But in the games where Oregon can really drag a team through the ringer, where you really expect them to show their team quality at the depth that they possess, Evan Stewart's the guy. And there are going to be games where Dillon Gabriel will take over. It's going to be games where Tez Johnson takes over. There will also be games where Evan Stewart might surprise some people, because he still has a lot of value there, and it just hasn't been represented in the best way, and maybe this new fit at Oregon will help him. But that'll just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we talk about one of the most versatile players in college football. You might not like that I'm talking about him, but he certainly could be an intriguing fantasy option should he play more as a wide receiver. You definitely don't want to miss this next segment. We'll be back after the break to talk about that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?